Yurdi Marang Nindaga, Jazu and Nadi, Waradri, Yana Baladu, Gandangara, Nurambangwarana. Hello, my name's Jazz. I'm a Wiradjuri woman speaking from my home in the Blue Mountains on beautiful sovereign Darug and Gundungurra country. I want to pay my respect to their elders past, present, and all those who are coming after now, and just give my gratitude for their care of the sky, land, and waters on which I live and work. And I guess just quickly, I'm a writer, I guess, and a digital producer and a filmmaker and like just whatever. And very excited to be having this chat.
So Yindamalija Gamagu Nurumbangu, Yindamalija Gamagu Mujigangu, Yindamalija Nadi Mujigangu, Yurumorang Nindugi, Yuan Nadi Nathan Sentence, Waraji Give Baladu. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gamagu people, which has never been ceded to invaders, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And acknowledge that wherever I go on these lands, now often referred to as Australia, that in that land and in that sky and in the seas that shape us, the data that's embedded within them. And also like to quickly take this chance to sort of, even though it's inadequate, to sort of share my support and to those up in Brisbane fighting for justice for Arnie Sherry. And I wish them, strength and courage with this ongoing battle. And my name's Nathan Sentance. I'm a Wiradjuri man, family traditionally from Mudgee, but I mostly grew up on Dark and Jung country on the New South Wales Central Coast, and I work mostly in museums and libraries and sort of I'm kind of a writer, but not really. But I write a lot. I have lots of thoughts and opinions on museums and libraries. So writing is one of the mediums that I try to get out said opinions.
I think you're a writer. Yeah, and also just to kind of, in the spirit of this like digital age, acknowledge that we're broadcasting to people from all across this continent, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and that ancestors are watching over all the land and skies on which this like digital format of communication will reach. Yeah, I guess I'm just super excited to have a yarn with you.
Yeah, definitely.
But I was thinking just then when you were introducing yourself, I'd love to just like know how you describe your job and the sort of work that you've been doing over the last few years in like the decolonizing of the museum sector, because my background has like been as an arts worker. Yeah. And I think there's a really interesting interplay between like data sovereignty and the cultural sector.
For sure. And like I guess like sites that I've previously worked on. So I currently work at the Australian Museum, but I previously worked at the State Library of New South Wales. Both very colonial institutions, both of the first of their kind within this country. And have both been heavily involved in colonization, but themselves are like, and I don't think a lot of people think of them that way, I guess, places that are holding data. And I think one of the things that I've been trying to do within my work, especially now in my current role as a digital program manager, is to sort of, I think, because like even like not just talking about the cultural data within our organization, I think one of the damaging things of all data is how it's interpreted, how it's analyzed. And I think for a very long time in the cultural sector with museums, the cultural data within it has, cultural objects hold their own power and hold their own stories, have data embedded within them. But for a long time, the, I guess, metadata, the data about that data has been, and how that data has been analysed, has been through sort of a Western scope, and through sort of and that interpretation is can be very dangerous, I believe, in the sense that it describes who we are to other people and describes our culture to other people. And I think it's very similar how, you know, people will misuse government data or research data to, you know, posit, you know, Indigenous inferiority and other sort of, you know, racist ideas, and they'll sort of create data for that. I think they have done that previously by analysing our cultural data within cultural institutions. So it's something that I've been trying to work on, to have, you know, Indigenous people have mob reconnect with the data in their collection, to re-describe it, to be the only ones that can interpret that data. And it may not be, you know, because of the power imbalance within institutions, it might not be complete self-determination or autonomy, but it's at least the beginning of some sort of control of data. Yeah.
I guess I think it's important to note that when we're talking about data, like, because it's the 21st century and because it's a digital age, like, a lot of people think when they hear data that they're talking about digital data and sort of code and the way that figures are, you know, represented like a census. But I think, like, when blackfellas talk about data, that has this incredibly long line that goes back to, you know, the first sunrise, since before time began, because we've been managed, like, holders of complex data, and we've managed that information through, like, song and dance and ceremony and oral history, and our objects are our data as well, just as much as the way that, you know, the contents of a book is data. And I think that's something that folk, like non-Indigenous folk, really seem to struggle with, like, when you're talking about cultural objects and saying, like, this has sacred knowledges embedded within it, and we need to be able to access that, and we need to be able to access, like, every iteration of that and control it is like so imperative, but also seems really straightforward.
Yeah,
like, it just
100%.
doesn't seem like that big an ask.
Yeah, 100%. Do you think this is kind of like two questions, but how do you think like First Nations people as a whole, because I guess, like, people have a certain, again, as you were saying, a certain idea around data. Do you think we're kind of undervalued as data managers? And like, and yeah, and this is heaps separate to that first question, but with the digital space, it's like, you know, there's, you know, there's fear, because, like, data, like, stealing of data has become really popular, without not even talking through the cultural lens, just our everyday data that we're consistently creating. But is the digital realm exciting or scary for, like, say, cultural data, the opportunities that brings to cultural data, and considering yourself as not just as like a like, you know, a First Nations person, but also a First Nations creative who is creating, you know, continuations of our cultural knowledge, and your own personal experiences as becoming sort of is sort of data and stuff. So is the digital world, like, yeah, but just wondering what you think of that.
a lot of thoughts. What was the first part of that? Like, how data...
Do you think, I was thinking more like, do you think we're undervalued as data managers, like First Nations people? Like,
totally. Like, we've developed systems that have been perfected over, like, you know, if we're talking in a sort of Western scientific lens, like, those numbers are incredibly large for how long we've been on this continent managing the lands and the skies and the waters, and our responsibilities to each other. And all of that is, like, so thick with data, you know, data management. And the fact that, like, I genuinely believe that we're the best placed people to sort of lead a data revolution and a data sovereignty movement, because we've perfected these systems, and the ways that things are coded and recoded and shared and, you know, access given and access assessed within our communities is so complex. I've said that a lot, but I think we could learn so much from our elders and our histories by, you know, understanding what's been taught to us and reinterpreting that level of information for our broader, you know, society of Indigenous and non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. Like, the ways that we can learn from our elders is so infinite in this space. And I don't understand why it seems that the society at large views like Indigenous folk as not having the literacy to deal with this stuff, right? Like, that our data can be taken from us and we don't have the ability to manage it ourselves.
For sure. That's actually, in talking about writing, that's actually one of the things that actually got me started writing about opinions on sort of museums, was the fact that I always thought that the way that people talk about data in sort of, especially places like archives and museums, was kind of flawed, where I just thought it was paternalistic. So a lot of times, because I used to work on like a language project at an archive, and they digitized all this language material to sort of with the intention to make that information more accessible to communities. But talking to people like donors and talking to people like even just like fellow people working in the space, they were like, well, isn't it great that that this information is being preserved, because without it, it would be gone forever. And I always thought that was flawed, because like, we're talking about culture that's lasted since time immemorial. And the only reason why it needs preserving, like understandably, a lot of that information has been, you know, in many cases, you know, intentfully destroyed through colonization. So that's why it needs to be now preserved and now reconnected with. But that's only exists because of colonization, and that's the same reason why museums exist. And also too, like, there is beneficial ways, like museums can be beneficial now with re-access to data to sort of revitalize some cultural practice or reconnect with cultural, you know, learnings. But at the same time, museums weren't made for that. They're not benevolent organizations. They were, in many cases, you know, trying to quote unquote document, you know, a dying race, or justifying the scope of colonization with the data that they were collecting and interpreting. They were imposing a worldview on many people who would visit these spaces. So, and they helped create a narrative with this data that supported and justified colonization. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting thing, considering these places are considered. And also too, I think one of the interesting things, and I think this comes up a lot with repatriation, is like a lot of people see a lot of, especially international organizations, what they'll do is they'll have like conditional repatriation. You know, they'll like only repatriate things if a community can meet their preservation standards. And I always feel like it's really awful. Like, I remember with I think it was Cambridge with the Guigal spears. They said they'd only return them if, you know, they'll return them, but if you can prove that you have museum quality preservation. And I always think that it's such a flawed way that
it's not theirs to
again,
determine. They stole it.
yeah,
Like, you don't get to steal something and then say, I'm only going to give it back to you if I like if I like you enough, you know, if I've deemed your standards worthy to my standards. The thief.
Yeah. And it's like, and also repatriation should be fulfilling autonomy. Like, it should be, again, self-determination. So I believe, like, if repatriation is true, then, you know, the Guigal community could get those spears back and decide to break them and burn them. Like, they can decide the journey of those spears. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they don't have to. And I think that's another misconception, where data has to, especially in museum context, it has to be in this sort of physical sense, be preserved, where, as we were talking before, like, our oral histories have sort of this oral information, this data, and it sort of data, and like our data can kind of have like a living journey, and I think unnaturally being preserved behind glass sort of is not the way that journey is meant to go, and then I think that data cease becoming as useful as it can be without sort of being part of our living culture. But
Yeah, like objects. Sorry, what were you going to say?
oh no, you go, you go.
I was going to say, like, the idea of things being kept in cabinets, right, is not keeping them safe. Like, these are objects that are inscribed and reinscribed with you know, country and care and human interaction, and locking them up in a cabinet is doing the exact opposite of how they're meant to function, and the way that we keep them alive by, like, you know, using them and then laying them to rest in that way. I remember I saw Wesley Enoch giving a keynote at a conference last year, the CMAM conference, and he gave this great analogy of, like, you know, Western museums, and they love to grab the debris left over from ceremony. Like, if something happens and like, it's the curators and whoever else, the museum folk, who like run around and grab all the things that are left behind, and community looks at it and they're like, no, that's done. Like, that's a dead object. You don't, what are you doing with that? Like, you're going to put it in a glass box, but why? What a weird place to put a shield.
That's so true. I forgot what I was going to say then. Oh no, I was going to ask you too, because like we were having multiple conversations about data, but this sort of conversation is sort of stemmed from an article that's really deadly about sort of, I think it's titled "Sacred Data" for the National Association of Visual Arts. I think I got that right. It's really deadly. It's awesome. But what sparked you to write that article? Like, what was there a thing that sort of made you go, I need to write about this?
Yeah, definitely. There was so for the, like, super deadly Sydney Biennale this year, the 2020 edition, called Niran, curated by Brooke Andrews. There was a 3D print of a dendroglyph that was in the exhibition, and I was just like so struck by the lack of provenance in that object, and the capacity for people to say, like, that's not sacred. And we the Pitt Museum in the UK, who have stolen this object and put it behind glass, have the ability to scan it and reproduce it and offer it to be 3D printed anywhere in the world. I was just like so devastated, like really genuinely heartbroken. And, you know, the provenance was such that they couldn't even say, like, if it's Wiradjuri or Gamilaroi. Like, they could just like, there was just a part of a vague map that they could point to for this object. And then if you go on the Pitt Museum website, it's just full of sacred objects from across the globe that have been stolen by these, like, gammon anthropologists who were roaming around whenever they were doing their stuff, just pinching shit. And, like, it really broke my heart. And I was thinking about the way that I guess there seems to be, like, this Western way of viewing things that are digital, that they are somehow extracted from this, like, living cultural world that the object exists in, and therefore the data exists in. And when I was in Aotearoa last year, I was really lucky to be able to go to the National Digital Forum there in Te Whangatuiatawa, Wellington, and Te Whanganuiatawa in Wellington, at Te Papa. And there was this great example of the way that Maori custodians at the New Zealand archives are dealing with their data and treating them with ceremony, and, you know, really, really acknowledging the life force that is embedded in the objects that they are custodians for, and therefore the data of those objects. And I would love to think that we're moving towards that in this, you know, continent, but I don't know. Do you reckon we are?
I don't think so. I think yeah, we are. And I was going to talk about I was at the Museum Galleries Australia conference last year, and one of the keynote speakers was Sean Angeles, Arundel man, works with the Strello Museum, and he was talking about something similar where he was talking about the digitization of the Strello collection that he was working on, and works heavily in repatriation. And he was talking to this audience of mostly non-Indigenous museum practitioners, how he was just saying things like, once you digitize something and, you might be trying to digitally repatriate it, um, and, a lot of museums do that in the form of, which I don't actually think is repatriation. I think it's just giving copies to a community, but they'll do things like they'll, put this information on a USB and mail it to the community. And Sean Angeles was just saying, you realize once you put those sacred objects onto that USB, the USB itself becomes sacred. So you need to be mailing it through just the general mail is, very dangerous. And he was saying this to a lot of non-Indigenous museum practitioners, and I could see that a lot of the people in the crowd have never thought of that before. So I think it may be getting. I think there is a detachment when it comes to the digital that can create an illusion of I guess as you're saying, people have an idea that it becomes less sacred, or and it is scary too, because once we digitize things we put them onto big servers that we have some security over, but we don't have complete control over that, and uh, who even internally can maybe potentially access that information and so forth. But that will go back to my previous question that I was going to ask. Do you think that the digital world, the digital realm, is that a positive or a negative thing for, say, cultural data? And as your perspective was, previously working in sort of with some institutions, but also in your work as a First Nations creative, does the digital world provides opportunities, but also is it beneficial and detriment? How do you see it?
I think we're living in a digital age, and I think we have a responsibility to be. I don't think we can be afraid of it because it's already here, and we have to work with it, and we have to use it in the way that benefits us and our communities, and always be looking to our elders and our communities as to how we can use this data, how we can use these tools, and how we can make these tools work for us. I think I feel as a young digitally literate Black fella, I have a responsibility to my community and people who don't have this knowledge base to be someone who is aware of the risk but also the potential. And I do think there's a huge amount of potential, and I think the net dangers, which are massive, we need to figure out the best way of minimizing them so that the net potential is something that we're working with. And that I think is really exciting. I think so many Black fellas a diaspora from their countries and their homelands, and I'm one of those people, and the possibilities of connecting with culture and country and kin through the digital medium is no one uses Facebook the way Black fellas use Facebook. They're so deadly on it. And I have a Wiradjuri language app on my phone. We're living in this age where we can be vital and bring vitality to our tools, and we should, because if we don't, then people will speak for us and are going to use our data against us and not with us in mind. And I think we need to do what we can to counter that.
100%. And yeah, I completely agree. And there has been those just even thinking about social media, and I know social media is run. It's all of them are like semi-evil conglomerate organizations, and I just watched that documentary, like that Social Dilemma, and it just makes you like people such, but also too at the same time, like there's so much, there's so much in the mainstream of like gatekeeping our voices or people speaking for us, that social media has been that space where we can just sort of say, this is us, like this is what I believe on this, and it's also being able to um, bring to the forefront so many issues stemming from ongoing invasion. And yeah, it's cool. Even with a lot of First Nations creatives, it's awesome that they don't need middlemen. You know what I mean? Like they can become, they can do things like become insta famous, and then that helps them, get their stories and out there. And I think that is really cool. Yeah, I think, but yeah, and again, I do think there is that thing where, yeah, we just go to, and I think, but we've been pretty good where we've, again, because of how mob use social media, especially like Facebook and Twitter, I've seen them be able to, it in some ways bring accountability to some things when people do try to steal our data. Many cases of which is the scary bit. You might put some artwork on Etsy and then someone just copies the image, tries to copy the image and make a carpet out of it. And there's been, instances of that. But like at the same time, because of the digital world, we've also been able to bring accountability to that, where previously, in a more, I guess, quote unquote analog world, there's been many times that people overseas have, I think there's heaps of like historical precedents of people just coming here, seeing like taking a photo of an artwork in an art gallery or an artwork at a cultural site, and then copying that for their own design in the future. And I think, so yeah, but yeah, oh, sorry, you go.
No, you go.
No, I was gonna just ask, like, in all the different realms of like all the different like sort of meanings we're sort of talking about data, how do you think you work with data as like a multidisciplinary artist, creative person?
Yeah, I think the relationship between like kind of what we were saying before, I think anything that we produce is a data filled thing. And like like I write poetry as kind of one of my primary creative things, but I also make films. And I think both of those objects are like both of those creative outputs are really rich with data, but in very different ways. Like as a filmmaker, it's a really collaborative process, and it's really like I work predominantly with First Nations communities when I'm making films, and it's so important to me that like what is being depicted and represented is being done on the terms of the people who are being depicted and represented. Like it's so straightforward, and yet something that has seemingly escaped filmmakers across the globe for the better part of the existence of the film industry. And I think that's a really powerful thing, to be able to have self-represented people like addressing a camera in the way that they choose to address it, and then disseminating that information. Being able to work with people in language and like bring bilinguality to that space, and deprioritizing English, I think is really like exciting, and something that I'm also increasingly trying to do in my writing, as like someone who's learning Wiradjuri in a like gusto but solo manner. But I think also like poetry, and there are so many incredible poets across this continent who really understand like the way that codifying language, like how powerful it is, and how one word can mean like so many complex things to so many different people simultaneously, and that you can be very deliberate and very like deceptively subtle, and with the tools at the disposal of like our languages and also the colonizers' language. Which I think I guess putting stuff out into the world, there is potential to, like, you know, blackfellas get ripped off all the time, which is scary. But I think, you know, the more we have a voice in that space, and like you were saying, the more we can call people out and the more that we can sort of rally together. Like, we don't need to physically be together we can do that digitally. Like, we can advocate for ourselves in a digital way. And, you know, nothing like a global pandemic to bring that to the forefront of everyone's minds. But like, I'm so grateful for those tools of connection and this digital space, because like over the past 6 months, like I haven't been able to see many people, and the fact that I could go online and connect with, you know, like my Aboriginal like family and brothers and sisters and kin from across the continent, like just at my fingertips, is such a gift, because there are things that we're all living through and, you know, living within this colony that is hostile towards us. And like, if you're alone in that, it's terrifying, but being able to come together is what gives us strength so much of the time.
100%, yeah. And it's really, as you're saying, like, it's really cool, like the power of the digital world for connection. And I think that's one of the better things about it. And like, even like, this is kind of very tangential, but with like my work, even in museums, one of the cool things I think that can happen, because like, and this happens, and of course we have to be mindful of individual protocols, but the potential of the digital world is that our community may be able to connect to some of the cultural data that we hold in these collections, even though, because I think, you know, a place like the British Museum will say the reason why it has all this cultural heritage, it's stolen cultural heritage, is because it's a museum for all, which is, yeah, it's yuck. It's so bad. It's like, but they have a mindset, because when, you know, probably when it was established, they considered themselves the center of the world, but they don't even understand like the geographical barriers to that. Like even at the Australian Museum, we actually had this really deadly Native Hawaiian feather worker come to the museum. And what they were doing was they were recreating a feather cloak we have in the collection. So they were examining it, and they were recreating a version of it. And we sort of commissioned that, and I thought it was really cool. But at the same time, I did get a tad sad, because we invited this artist because they were really deadly at this type of work. But I was thinking about like that artist's like cousins and uncles and aunties that you know, aren't feather workers at the museum. We're not. They have to pay their own way to come see a part of their own cultural heritage. Um, so I hope the digital world can, you know, sometimes I'm hoping more in sort of in the space of physical repatriation rather than digital repatriation, but in those spaces we can create more connections. And also, even too, like, one of the exciting things I think about the digital world is our way to, again, redescribe data, but also categorize data. At the moment, you know, a lot of museums have their own ways of taxonomies and stuff like that. I think in the digital space, where we don't actually have to worry about, you know, things like just general physical shelving, is like we can recontextualize those relationships, and we can make those relationships be about those cultural objects created by ancestors. We can create relationships between them and country, or them and ancestors, or them with this object, or this some of our like non-human kin. We can create those relationships and make people understand those relationships, rather than have straight taxonomies of, like, you know, all boomerangs from New South Wales together, or shields from New South Wales together, like those very strict taxonomies. So that's I think one of the exciting things about sort of the digital space from like a musology perspective.
Yeah, I think that's it. Like, there's so much exciting potential in these spaces with our voices there, right? Like,
Yeah.
You know, to borrow the phrase from, you know, the movement for disability recognition, nothing about us without us. Like, when we're there, not only is the product safer. It's better. Like, it's going to be more interesting and more innovative and richer for our society at large, not just the Indigenous community. Like, we have so much like exciting shit to bring this space. I was talking to someone a few months ago, and they were saying that like in their community there's like it's a community whose, or it's a country where there's a big colonial city on it now. And so a lot of the folk have had to like leave the city. And they're trying to figure out a way of like being able to bring together cultural information in a safe way online. And one of the ideas is to inscribe everything on the website in their language, which means that only fluent speakers would be able to decipher the website. And the thinking behind that is like, it's great on a few levels, right? Because it means that it's encouraging like people to become fluent speakers, but it also means that you have this like really rigorous system that people have to get through. And if you're like a cultural thief, that's a lot of work. Which, I mean, I like to think that a thief wouldn't go to that level, right? Like you're going to do something a bit easier. But like it's such a simple example of a really innovative way of bringing together like ancient knowledges and the digital present. And I'm excited to see what happens in that space.
For sure. I think that's one thing that I think in considering that, like talking about like fluidity of like language or something like that. That's one thing that I do think, I guess, like sort of from a Western lens and considering the digital age that we live in, sort of probably does clash with what like I've been sort of brought up with from First Nations communities is like, I am actually like am a very big sort of like in just generally besides First Nations knowledge, I'm a very big sort of like open data person. Like I was very much into like the open access movement and stuff like that within libraries, making academic information readily available. But I think there is a thing with sort of people's belief that with some cases that like knowledge is an entitlement rather than something that you have to sort of work to gain, which I think is one thing that sort of is different from like sort of like the digital age. And it's something that I think would be good in considering like when people do consider the digital age, like around First Nations knowledge is that, just because it exists doesn't mean you have a right to it. And like, even as First Nations people ourselves, we have to prove ourselves worthy to gain certain informations and to know certain things, and some things even just as like a First Nations person who identifies as a man, I just will never be privy to, and I have to be okay with that. Like, and I think that that's probably something that's different to sort of like in the sense of the digital world where we have access to information all the time, so there is a tendency to believe that you are entitled to certain information. But I think that's just something to consider with sort of like protocols and stuff like that. Yeah, and
Totally. It makes me think a little bit. Sorry, were you going to?
No.
It makes me think a bit like like our data, like ceremony and dance and song and story, like that isn't owned by the individual, so it's not up to the individual to give it away. Like, it's collective information, but like you're saying, like it has access points and it has restrictions, and that's something that like big data corps around the world are struggling with at the moment, right? Like, how do you know if someone should be accessing your data? And like without a robust system of protocols, or like aunties and uncles who are sitting there saying yes and no, like we need to be better at thinking about these problems. Like, we need to look at things that have worked in the past, like our blackfellow systems of management to figure out the way to go forward with these really complex issues. And I think, no, you go.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I agree, and it's like what you were saying with like a fair amount of your points. Like what you were saying is like I think a data revolution led by First Nations people would be beneficial to all. Like I think that's one of the things is like it should be led by us just due to the nature of like self-determination, the lands that we are on, and but I also think it would just be beneficial, like you were saying, like a data like the embedding of these Indigenous ways of thinking into a data would actually be super beneficial because we can see how like particularly in like thinking about like algorithms now as like that we've been shown how predatory some of these algorithms can be that have even in some cases unintentionally but just through that sort of like Western and mostly like male lens has sort of created these sort of predatory like algorithms that have affected just how data is curated, but also how data is looked at. Like there was that thing, that example where, and this is actually more about the data source, about like how bad historic art has been. Where do you remember the thing where Google was doing that Google Art thing where you could take a selfie and it would find a painting that would look like you?
Yeah,
Like,
and every person of Asian heritage got the same image.
yeah, and also like or so many Black Americans got images of like slaves, from old slavery images, like the old caricatures were what would come up with them. And again, no one when Google was making this thought about this because they were a particular race and probably a
Surprise,
particular gender.
surprise.
Yeah. So it can just show how easily, depending on where the data is coming from, but also depending on who's creating the systems to manage or analyze the data can be very sort of detrimental. And that's sort of where Indigenous ways of knowing could be very beneficial um, for everyone.
Yeah, it seems like intuitive to think that our digital tools are objective, but
Mm,
when our tools are built in a racist system, our tools are racist, right? Like AI is a racist thing because it's been overwhelmingly built by racist people,
yeah.
or in a racist system. Not out and out whatever folk, but like there is we can only make things as good as the society that produces them.
Mm,
And it it doesn't seem like a stretch to assume that our AI is going to be racist going forward until we have our voices in that space and representation of all in producing those tools. I was going to say something that was going to be really clever, but I can't remember.
yeah.
Yeah, save me.
No, but I think it's I think that's like just part of like historically just how a lot of systems are created. Like again, going back to working in museums and libraries, they're spaces that are considered neutral. You know what I mean? Like it's not
Yeah,
considered how people how how people just even display cultural objects implies certain ways of thing or like you know just I always think about like just even we used to at the Australian Museum and we've luckily changed since then, but when I first started at the Australian Museum I think the idea behind it wasn't bad, but what happened was they thought like when you enter the museum there should be something that's First Nations should be the first thing you come in contact with. So they had these big rainforest shields in this cabinet. But because the provenance information, the metadata about this data was so poor, it basically said like, rainforest shield, far north Queensland. Um, these shields were collected by Dr. Walter Roth, who was the protector of Aboriginals in Queensland, and it just had this whole biography of Dr. Walter Roth. But it's because that's the information that they have. And again, because again, I think they had like say a good intention behind it, but of course that has not a neutral effect, and the people reading that have not a neutral response. Like it actually feeds into their brain, so that because it has an effect, of course it's not neutral, and because it's created by people who in myriad ways are not neutral, it leads to sort of this, yeah. So I think just even just breaking away ideas of neutrality and that our and any sort of systems, especially heavily Western systems, are neutral. And it's not bad that they're not neutral, which is something that we need to, like know so we can actually address, like um, pretending that pretending that uh, the representation now in different sorts of mediums is you know, it's just based on meritocracy rather than, biases, will never create change. And yeah, it's like even what you're saying is like it's, and there's even like a simplicity to it, which is kind of mind boggling, but it's like what you're saying with like the work that you do in digital producing and video making or videography is like you work very collaboratively and you facilitate self-representation, but that still is not that common. Like I know that Oz Screen have to actually really give heavy guidelines because and they've only created them just recently because people would just assume that First Nations topics are theirs and they'll yeah, like, and I think it even happened to people that we know where they'll get asked to do something and get heavily edited or to prescribed what they can and can't say. And again, that becomes again data that lives out there, but it's been heavily curated before it's become the sort of final product.
Totally, which is an issue like across, I think, all creative worlds where people feel like they have a right to reproduce, you know, uh, you tell an Indigenous story or paint an Indigenous style painting, and it just like boggles the mind as to how people. I think it comes back to what you were saying before. Like, not only is it sacred, it's dangerous. Like, you shouldn't mess with things that haven't been given to you. Like you don't have the access permissions to that stuff. There's
Mm,
heaps of stuff even within our culture where I wouldn't go near it even as a Wiradjuri woman, because like it's not my part of our Wiradjuri society to speak on.
mm,
And that's dangerous. And like it really upsets me that we're still having these conversations, and that like you kind of think like we must have gotten there by now, but we haven't, and it's devastating. But I guess just having more people speaking about these issues is kind of the first steps to some of the change. Like even in the arts industry, it's been a change that I reckon I can chart in the time that I've been paying attention, which isn't that long. The way that like a lot of contemporary Indigenous artists are now being recognized as contemporary artists, not
mm,
Indigenous artists. That we can recognize that someone can come from an ancient practice but be a contemporary artist, and that doesn't seem like it should have taken so long, but that is still that's a radical framework if you go internationally for a lot of colonial societies still.
yeah, for sure. And I think and that's an issue with like again like data, like very strong opinions on what is quote unquote Indigenous. Again, like 3D reproduction of work is does sometimes people think of that as less sacred, as you're saying, or even like recreations of, uh, or just like even though like there's many Indigenous artists that I know that are reclaiming cultural practices, but because of the changes in the environment, have to do it differently. You know what I mean? Like that they can no longer use. I know I was talking to some mob from the Americas, First Nations mobs, and they make whale drums, and they were saying like it's a very important part of our practice, but because of the scarcity of whales, we have to use different resources. That a synthetic resource that seems very similar to whale in how it reverberates, but that's kind of what they have to do. And then they were saying that, I remember them talking about it, and them saying, like, some people will say that they're now contemporary drop, like they will act as if they're less traditional than previous because of how they're created. And it's just like, it's the effects of colonization, but also too, like Indigenous, like, like there are a lot of, Indigenous like technologies and Indigenous law and stuff like that that's been, similar or the same since time immemorial, but all of that has adapted to, like, we lived through an ice age, so we've adapted to different environments and different materials that have come. So, like, we're ever evolving. So it is, there is that weird thing where it's sort of like contemporary and sort of, and considering data. Yeah.
I completely agree. Like, as a society that has had to live through not just pandemics, but the apocalypse, right? Like, we're so adaptive and we're so resourceful, and our ancestors have taught us survival and have imbued survival within us. And I think, like, taking those learnings and applying them to every facet of our life, but also this digital age, which, is somehow seen by non-Indigenous folk as being inherently Western or inherently, coming from outside an Indigenous perspective. Like, we only have so much to, like, we have so much to learn and so much to gain by having these conversations that I just can't wait to see what happens next. And, like, the more people we have in this field and the more people that, like, can recognize, what we can say and what we can do, but also have, like, non-Indigenous folk recognizing that as well and being excited to work with us makes me really, like, hopeful. We've run out of time, but I could just keep talking.
It was Monday Guru for this chat. It was really awesome.
Monday Guru, Maji. Thank you.